Our segment today is on budgeting. We're going to discuss what is a budget, how's a budget used. We're going to talk about 3 different types of budgets. Every one of you should be using one of those types of budgets. And then we're going to take a look at variable and fixed expenses. You'll have a better understanding of how to use those expenses and how to distinguish between the variable and the fixed expenses. The next segment we're going to look at is budgeting. The things we're going to talk about during budgeting is what is a budget. We're going to look at 3 types of budgets people use. And when we're establishing our budget or working on our budget, we need to understand the variable and fixed expenses. We've heard people talk about creating budgets. People live by a budget. But what is that thing called a budget? A budget is a spending plan. And I underline plan because it's only a plan. It's not something that's locked in. If I budget a certain dollar amount for a specific item, that doesn't mean I have to spend that. By the same token, if I have to spend more than I budgeted, that can be done as well. We'll look at some of the consequences of that. But the budget is a spending plan. It's not something that we have locked in. The dollars are designated for specific areas. And the more general we keep the budget, the harder it is to track, but we don't want to get so specific that we feel boxed in. When we're creating a budget, we're looking at our income and our expenses. So where do those numbers come from? The first place would be a cash flow statement. And we'll talk here in a little bit about how to create the cash flow statement. The cash flow statement is the actual expenditures versus the budget, which was the plan. So we can have a cash flow statement before the budget, and we can have a cash flow statement after the budget. Remember, I said a plan. The plan implies that it might be changed. A budget can be changed. When you're working on your budget, you want to review the cash flow statement to find excess or unusual amounts. So what is the budget? The budget is a plan on how we're going to spend our money, what we're going to spend our money on. And even though we focus primarily on the expenses, the budget definitely includes the income as well. Now, I told you we were going to talk about 3 types of budgets. The first one is a written budget. Well, let me back up. Let me ask you, ask yourself, how many of you actually use a budget? Some of you say yes, some of you say no. So we'll look at these types of budgets. The written budget, we have an envelope budget, and we have a mental budget. Now, those of you who said, no, I don't use a budget, I'm thinking you probably have a mental budget. You have an idea in your mind. Even though you've never written this down, you have an idea how much money you're going to be spending. A written one, you literally write down your expenses by category. What are some of those categories? Most textbooks, there's numerous resources online that will give you different categories, but clothing, food, utilities, insurance, savings, entertainment. There's all kinds of categories that you can have. List your categories and then take a look at how much do we want to put into each one of those categories. The best source for those categories is your cash flow statement. We'll take a little better look at that here in a bit. The envelope system. Put the money in a designated envelope and use it as needed. That means you have an envelope for each one of the categories. You have a grocery envelope. You have a clothing envelope. You have an entertainment envelope. You have a rent envelope. Whatever your categories are, you're going to put the dollar amounts that you plan on spending in that category into the envelope. The envelope system, or envelope budget, is particularly useful for people who have a hard time managing money. If you have money in your pocket, do you have this burning desire to spend it? Well, maybe you want to use an envelope system. I said earlier we can make adjustments to our budgets. The envelope system is the easiest way to help people understand the consequences of making adjustments. If Johnny wants a new 75 pair of shoes, and I've budgeted $100 for clothing and already spent $75, can I get Johnny his shoes? Well, if we don't make any changes, there's only $25 left. So I can't get the shoes. If I get the shoes, I have to find the other $50 from somewhere. Where does it come from? If I take it out of the grocery envelope, later this month, I may come up short when I'm ready to buy groceries. Now what? I'll take it out of the gas money. Are you planning on walking? Understand the consequences if you decide to take money from one category to another. The mental budget, I have a plan and I know what it is. I'm not writing it down because then I might be held accountable. I don't need the envelope system because I can manage my money. I got it. I know what it is. This is what most people who say they do not use a budget actually have. They say they don't use a budget, but they have a mental budget. They know when they've spent too much on groceries or when they've spent too much on entertainment, and they manage it and cut back. It does hold you less accountable, but it also gives you the flexibility. Now, we need to develop the budget. Hopefully you understand what the budget is. We need to develop that budget. I've talked a couple times about the cash flow statement. Let's figure out what that monster is. The cash flow statement is a record of all your cash flow over a certain period of time. I recommend keeping a cash flow statement for a month. Most expenses will come up once a month. If you only do it for a week and you don't pay rent that week, you have low expenses. Or you decide to cut back on groceries that week. You don't have very many expenses. It's going to be hard to keep track for an entire year or even 6 months. A month gives you a very good perspective of where your money is being spent. Be realistic. The month you decide to keep track of your cash flow, don't change your habits. If you go out every Friday night, continue to go out every Friday night so you know how much you're spending on entertainment. If you generally buy gifts for people, buy gifts for people. Don't cut back on groceries. Don't cut back on things that you don't need. Live your life the way you would have lived it, where you're not keeping track, and then you'll have a realistic cash flow statement. Now, once you see that cash flow statement, we need to review that. Are my expenses out of line? That bottle of water I buy every day at school? That cup of coffee I get every morning on the way to school? I didn't realize I was spending $100 a month on drinks. I didn't realize I was spending $300 a month on fast food. or whatever your numbers may be. Hopefully you will see some items on your cash flow statement that may be a wake-up call, and you never realized you were spending that much money. Or our expenses understated. Maybe there were no birthdays that month, but you love to buy gifts for your friends. If expenses are understated, make sure you factor that in when you work out your budget. If you believe some expenses are overstated or out of line, see what you can do to change your lifestyle to get those expenses to where you're comfortable with them. You need to ask yourself, are my goals being met? One of the expenses, or multiple expenses if it need be, should be the amount of money that you're putting towards your goals. If you're putting $100 a month towards your emergency fund and $200 a month towards your housing fund or housing goal and money towards your retirement goal, but you don't budget for that, then you're not going to meet those goals. So we need to make sure our goals are met when we look at the cash flow statement. Now we've got all our expenses. Now we need to list all of our income. Now we go back to that cash flow statement, list the expenses by category, and then compare the income to expenses. In an ideal world, we would all have more income than expenses. In the real world we all live in, it just doesn't seem to work that way. So we need to either adjust income or expenses. Which expenses do we adjust? How do we adjust income? Well, let's first look at the expenses. We have fixed expenses and we have variable expenses. Some stay the same, some change. A good example of a fixed expense that stays the same each month would be your rent, your cell phone bill, and insurance premium. Now, some of you may say, oh, I only pay insurance once every 6 months. When you're doing making the adjustments on your cash flow statement, take that into account. If I have a $300 insurance premium that's only due every 6 months, go ahead and budget $50 each month towards insurance so that at that 6-month mark, you aren't short $300. Now, in addition to our fixed expenses, we have variable expenses. Variable expenses are those expenses that change. Groceries, very few of us spend the same amount of money each month on groceries. Our heat bill is higher in the winter. Our air conditioning bill is higher in the summer. Food, entertainment, gas prices change constantly. Those are expenses that will change. Some of those we actually can control. You have total control over how much you spend on entertainment. You have some control over your utilities. You can turn the furnace down a couple of degrees and save a little bit. Gas, you can start walking. You can definitely cut back on your gas expense. What about savings? Fixed or variable? The money that we're saving, applying towards our goals, would you consider those fixed expenses or variable expenses? I would say it's fixed. Because if you save whatever's left over after all your other expenses, you won't save. So list those dollar amounts that you have designated for goals as fixed expenses. Put those right at the top of your budget and make sure that they get paid every month. Now you're on track to achieve your goals. You can adjust variable expenses so that you keep your expenses less than your income. That could mean lifestyle changes. Some of you, that will be significant or be a significant emotional event. For some of you, you can make changes without any real effort. Or you can adjust your income to make your income cover the expenses that you currently have. How do you adjust your income? Well, how about an extra job? Maybe work some overtime. Those are things you can do to adjust your income. So when we get to the end of developing our budget, we need to ask ourselves, did we spend our entire income or did we spend more? We compare our income to expenses and then adjust those variable expenses. Now we go back, make those adjustments to our plan, and hopefully get those numbers to balance. Now we have a balanced budget that we can make changes to if need be, but let's try to live by our budget. Okay, the three types of budgets we talked about were the written, the envelope, and the mental method. You should be using one of those types. When putting together your financial plan, you need to actually use the written budget. You may not use a written budget all the time, but for your financial plan, I want to see a written budget there. As you're going through your fixed and variable expenses, prioritize. Identify where you can cut some of those variable expenses, or, remember what I said, identify additional income if you're not going to cut the expenses. A budget will help you maintain your finances and keep you on track to your financial success.